TYT is partnering with Participant Media to help solve the climate crisis. Wouldn't that be great? Now, look, you got to check out our series, 10 Days of Action, to learn more about what you can do to make a difference. And go see an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power, in theaters in New York and LA on July 28th and nationwide August 4th.
The death toll in Venezuela has increased amid protests over a controversial vote that just took place. Now, this vote was all about replacing a legislative body known as the National Assembly in Venezuela with a pro-Maduro assembly, which essentially now has the power to rewrite the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, Maduro and his cronies won in this vote, and of course, people are calling this entire election a fraud, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But for those of you who want a little bit of a backstory before I get into the details of this recent update on Venezuela, there have been protests in Venezuela because of rapid inflation, lack of resources, because the economy there was so reliant on oil and also on importing products. As soon as oil prices went down, people started to go hungry. And so now people are taking to the streets, and Maduro's response to it has been draconian. And instead of taking responsibility for his actions, he has decided to essentially overthrow the legislative body and put in charge a pro-Maduro assembly, again, known as the I'll tell you what it's called in just a second. So just to go back to the death tolls in regard to these protests, the deaths bring the total to at least 122 killed in nearly 4 months of political upheaval. Venezuelans also appeared to be abstaining in massive numbers on Sunday when this vote took place in a show of silent protest against a vote to select a constitutional assembly, giving the government virtually unlimited powers. Again, these people will be allowed to rewrite the Constitution. And so as a result, in protest, people refused to take part in the election. They boycotted it. So at least 5,500 candidates for the 545 seats in the Constituent Assembly, that's what the new assembly is called, are his supporters. The Special Assembly being selected, or that was selected last Sunday, will have powers to rewrite the Constitution, the country's 1999 Constitution, but also have the powers above and beyond other state institutions, including the opposition-controlled Congress. So things are really, really bad in Venezuela. And again, Maduro continues to, compound the problem instead of take responsibility and step down.
So I'm going to give you a little bit of the other side in 1 second, but I want to give you context too. So now, because the opposition did not participate in these elections, as Anna told you, every seat in the assembly is Maduro's, his party's. In the previous National Assembly, 112 of the 167 seats was the opposition. Mm-hmm. And Maduro, right before the opposition got into power after the elections, basically packed the Supreme Court. It's a simple way of explaining what happened there. And so the Supreme Court protected him so that he can't be impeached. So then he went on to solidify his power by doing this election, which now the US government, among others, including, by the way, Mexico and Canada, are calling a sham election. Also Panama and many, Colombia and a lot of the other countries around there. But, so I think that is very likely exactly what's happening here. The reason I say but is that there is a deep history of propaganda that the U.S. has done in Latin America with countries that we don't like. And so there are, I want you to know, other countries that say, no, these elections were fine and Maduro's government is okay. And in fact, what is happening is orchestrated protests by the forces that don't want socialism to work in Latin America, and they're trying to bring down his government. So Nicaragua is on his side, Bolivia is also on its side, and so now again, more countries on the other side. Brazil against it, Guatemala against it. So giving you full context here. Now, this one seems pretty clear. Oh, by the way, Maduro says the people protesting him are terrorists. Now hold on. There was, now the reason I give you full context is because there was a bomb that went off by the police and they got injured. And so most of the violence has been directed at the protesters. Some of the violence has been directed at the police, which are with Maduro. So now, if it was us, if the minute there's any police violence, we'd say, yes, they're terrorists. All the protesters are terrorists. And so when we do a crackdown, we'd say we're justified, right? Now, I don't think Maduro is justified, but why I hated all the propaganda we've done in the past is because in a situation like this, it makes us a little unsure that we understand the full story.
Right.
Do you see what I'm saying by that?
Yes. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm an expert on this, but I find what's happening in Venezuela fascinating. So I have spent a lot of time kind of looking into it, researching and trying to figure out what's going on. And I understand that there's going to be propaganda on both sides, especially when issues related to socialism are involved. And I don't want to fall victim to that propaganda. But here's what I know for sure. And I've said this before when we've covered what's going on in Venezuela. It is not one thing. It is not just the fact that it's a socialist country. It is a number of factors that played a role in the economic downfall of the country, right? And so there was way too much reliance on oil. And, you know, Venezuela was doing great when oil prices were extremely high. But what happens when the oil prices go down? And so what they failed to do, what Hugo Chavez failed to do, and what, you know, the previous leader failed to do is, you know, take into consideration what happens when those oil prices dip. And so the oil prices dip. They did overspend their money on social programs. I am not against social programs. I think you need to have a mixed economy with, you know, private industry and public programs as well. But in this case, they overspent. They didn't save in case there was a doomsday. And then when things started to get really bad and people started protesting Maduro because the inflation was so high, he got dictatorial, and again, he made the problems worse. And so it's a combination of things. And by the way, one other factor, they were too reliant on importing products. They stopped making and manufacturing products in their own country. And so now they're super reliant on imports. Of course, that's going to raise the costs of the products that they need to survive. So it's a number of different things, and unfortunately, people are going to latch on to one thing or another for their own talking points and their own propaganda.
Yeah, don't get simplistic on either side. So let me give you one more on the other hand and then finally give you my opinion. When you look at how protests were orchestrated to take down the governments that actually represented their own people in Latin America in the past and in Iran in the 1950s, orchestrated by the CIA, this is what they look like. So I'm not saying they are in this case. I'm going to tell you what I think in a second about this particular situation. So that is why, though, when we see a situation like this, we go, okay, because of the wrongdoing we've done in the past, it makes us pause and go, are we falling victim to yet another ruse? And by the way, in those instances, the government would use, now this was decades ago, but would use reputable organizations, including the New York Times, definitely Time magazine over and over again, because it was run by a conservative that had deep connections to the CIA. And they would put out things like, oh, the democratically elected leader is dictatorial, and there's protests in the streets. I
mean, we did it with Panama, and, you know, look, we had economic interests with Panama. We wanted to have access to their canal, and I'm not going to sit here and say that Noriega was a great guy, but why do you think the U.S. was so interested in overthrowing Noriega?
We had to deal with him in the first place with the CIA, so if we thought he was such a bad guy, why'd you make a deal with him in the first place?
Exactly.
And the list goes on and on, let alone all the why we called them banana Republicans in the first place, because we would do coups on behalf of fruit companies. Now, there is one other thing that is similar here, is that sometimes the banks will then start saying, we're not going to loan you any more money, and put other financial pressure on, which would make some of these financial situations even more dire. That would make real people angry and then actually protest the government. And that's how you put pressure on a government. Now, having said that, in this case, looking at the totality of it, I don't think that's what's happened. And I base that on a number of things. Because Maduro, if you were genuine in this, you wouldn't have packed the Supreme Court, and you did. Again, it's oversimplifying a tiny bit to say that, but that was the effect of the decisions regarding the Supreme Court. And then if you've got an election where the opposition is not participating, you don't go, okay, I guess I win all 500 some odd seats. It's all mine. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to now change the Constitution and imprison my political opponents, which is what he's promising to do. No. Imprison your political opponents is not the right thing to do under any circumstance.
Yep. According to CBS, Maduro wants the assembly to strip opposition legislators of their constitutional immunity from prosecution, and indicated he is eager to prosecute many more members of the opposition parties that control a handful of state governments along with the National Assembly, providing one of the few remaining checks on the power of the Socialist Party. And by the way, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how the public feels in Venezuela in regard to what just happened, opinion polls say more than 70% of the country is opposed to Sunday's vote. And so it's kind of amazing because 70% is opposed to it. It's just like America, right? Where you're like, but who's the other 30%? Like, where have you guys been and why do you guys feel that way? But anyway.
No, but because Maduro says, look, the reason you're suffering is not because of me, but because of outside forces that are driving these economic problems in the first place. Now, again, I don't think the facts are on his side on that because they did not properly invest when oil prices were high, and they're doing price controls. Price controls and currency controls, generally speaking, especially price controls, are a disastrous economic idea. And now you can say, hey, Cenk, you're a capitalist, it's not fair. Look, we can argue over the words of capitalism, socialism, mixed economy. The reality is I think the government does some things better, military cops, but also education, healthcare. I think the government should provide healthcare so that you have equality of opportunity in education and just so you can live. I do think that companies make better sneakers and cars, okay? But when you do price controls, I've never seen it work in any economy. So you shouldn't be surprised that that decimated your economy. And he's pressuring 2.8 million state employees to participate in the elections, pressuring public employees to vote your way. And then they're giving out sandwiches. I mean, there's a host of things that they're doing that are clearly wrong. And when 70% of the country opposes what you're doing, it's not just some foreign journalists or foreign actors that are driving it.
Right.
Obviously, you've lost popular support in your country. And if you've got 70% opposed to you, and then you claim, no, all the seats in the assembly are now mine, you know that's not a legitimate government. Right. So that's my assessment of the situation. But I wanted you to know all the sides.